small film, never that widely distributed, but a wonderful film. It's a great piece to get a hold of sometime. And she went on to make 2 other films, too, because she had the courage to say, you know, I have a dream, I have an idea, and I just need someone to help me. And it was something so satisfying for her, and she was able to even find the backing. It didn't take that much money to do what she wanted to do, but it's the kind of thing that makes me remember that even if you think it's impossible and you're not experienced, if you get people to help you who are experienced, you often make a dream come true. So here we are. Our Bodies Ourselves is about 42 years old. We have had a wonderful symposium. We brought in some of our global partners, although we never designed the book to be following sort of a trajectory around the globe, coming up in something like 33 foreign language editions. We have partnered with extraordinary groups, a group of Palestinian and Jewish Israeli women in East Jerusalem, a group of women in Tanzania, in Nigeria, in Uganda, women in India. In fact, the Bangla edition, which came out, was a project of women in West Bengal and Bangladesh, so it crossed a border. Some of these books are regional. Right now, a group in Vietnam are doing a fabulous project, somewhat funded by the Ford Foundation. And the stories of all these projects, there are Armenian women I know who did a project in Yerevan, and Turkish women are about to produce a Turkish edition in Istanbul, hopefully later this year. They've been held back by the terrible challenges that they're facing now. And you probably read the international news, so you know their prime minister has started to stab women in the back, figuratively. After promising a lot of things, he's turned into a fundamentalist Muslim in the worst way, and women's rights are being set back daily there. So they've got their hands full in Turkey to make sure that they don't get set back even further. But these women who have taken the book and said, we want to adapt it, we want to make it into our own, are all facing similar challenges. There's always the challenge of sexism, of getting your recognition as a woman in your community. They're always facing, in somewhat different fashion, the challenges we've faced. The thing that they have much more of than we do, except for certain communities in this country where it's a big problem, is poverty. And in almost all of these settings, poverty is a much bigger issue than we have had to face here. But the access to reproductive health services and the questions around reproductive justice loom large now. And it is not just about access to contraception and abortion, which are important reproductive health services. It's access to information and knowledge about a lot of things, to understand assisted reproductive technologies better, to understand what surrogacy means. Now there's a whole booming industry involved in cross-border surrogacy. In fact, we have a newsletter out there that talks about it. So our partners in Nepal and India are trying to do something about the fact that many of the low-income women who don't have legal recourse if their rights are violated, and they are routinely, that they are somehow better protected as they engage in these surrogacy arrangements, or they become egg donors for couples whom they will never meet. These are important choices for women to make in this country as well. And they can be good choices, but they should be choices made with adequate information. So we've started to partner with researchers at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, people in the medical field who are concerned that we don't have any decent long-term safety data to guide decision-making for young women who want to provide eggs, whether it's for fertility purposes for couples or women who seek to become mothers or parents, or for research purposes. There are many researchers who are involved in something called somatic cell nuclear transfer, which needs fresh eggs in order to do this kind of research. And you've heard it referred to as research cloning. And there certainly are some legitimate uses for this research, but one of the things we are deeply concerned about is that young women who provide eggs, for whatever purposes, get adequate information about what we do and don't know. The National Perinatal Association, recent articles in the New England Journal of Medicine have shown a light on this problem, but we've been seeking partners in various corners to make sure that we reach young women, since they're not being reached in the traditional ways. We also have been particularly upset about the setbacks with the reproductive rights that we thought we had. And then this started a little you know, sort of got lots of attention with Todd Akin, you know, the infamous member of Congress who said, you know, if a woman's raped, you know, her body shuts down and she can't really get pregnant unless she really wanted the sex. This, you know, interesting new theory about women's bodies didn't fly too well with most women in this country. But what it led to, on our part and the part of many organizations like the American Association of University Women, the National Women's National Center for Women Policy Studies, and a few other groups, is that we recognize that young women were so focused on their social media, their reality TV shows, they weren't reading the newspapers and watching the kind of news on television that my cohort was. So increasingly, young women like my own niece, who had just turned 18 before the 2012 election, were telling us that they weren't going to register to vote because politics was boring. And these were young women who actually wanted access to contraception, and they wanted access to their reproductive health services, and they didn't have a clue of what was going on. I was a little shocked by this, but there were a couple of well-sampled studies that showed there was actually a lack of awareness, and although the young unmarried cohort was still projected to be the group least likely to vote in that election, that did not turn out to be the case, because there was this massive effort to educate younger unmarried women to think about what was at stake, look at what mattered to them, register and get out there and vote. And it was interesting that the women's vote, especially younger women who voted, did make a big difference. This was the kind of thing many of us didn't even know was going on in our own backyard. I was horrified that my niece would say something like that to me. And once I sat down with her and told her what was at stake, she was, no way, like, that can't be true. And I said, yeah, it's true. And she was in a community outside of Boston that was not filled with a lot of intellectual students. She told me there was one young man in her class who kept telling all the other students they should register, they should pay attention to politics. And she said, I like him, but we never listened to him. That interesting. And she knew lots of kids. She was popular. Maybe there were 30, 40, 50 kids in her circle. And I'm not sure many of them had intended to register. When she was done with them, I think they all registered. And that's the way it happened. And that's the way the kind of work we've done has happened over the years. We decided after the Our Bodies, Our Votes campaign, we even have bumper stickers out there if you'd like to take one as a souvenir, that the next step, we didn't actually think of this. It was a reporter who came to us and said, that's great, you've activated the public, but what about members of Congress? You think Todd Akin is the only one? This was a journalist in Washington. He said, it's endemic. Why don't you get a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves to every member of Congress? So then we started this Educate Congress campaign. We had an Indiegogo campaign. We raised the money. And we mostly mailed these, but we had a symbolic trip, a whole day, that ended up in Elizabeth Warren's office, and she's fabulous. But we did this with Christy Turlington Burns, and many of you know her because she was this famous model on the cover of Vogue, but she's gone on, like many of you are going to go on and do something different. She left the modeling world and she decided to get a degree in public health, which she's trying to finish at Columbia, but she started a group that is focused on maternal mortality, reducing maternal mortality worldwide. It's called Every Mother Counts. Got a great website, they do great work. So she, her executive director, and I walked the halls of maybe 3 or 4 House office buildings, a couple Senate buildings, with 2 wonderful young interns from the National Women's Health Network. And we had these meetings. We delivered the books, and in one case, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, who comes from the San Francisco area, took a special interest in these 2 college-age interns and drew them out in terms of what they wanted to do. And it was just the whole day was fabulous. And it led to a number of interesting thank you letters from members of Congress that we didn't meet. I met Republicans in the hallway who were pro-choice, who said they were very happy we were there. We even met with a Tea Party Republican from Illinois, and I swear to God, I don't think he knew what the book was. He just said, I'll meet with you. We had a nice time, but we didn't have a very long visit. So this is ongoing. We have a blog that's got all kinds of praise. We do a lot of social media, and then we have incidents like the one we're living through right now, where the buffer zone law here in Massachusetts gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and we're all looking at what might or might not be the vote in June when they tell us what they think. I think the result of that will say a lot about whether we have advanced this discourse much or not, because that is so clearly a case of preserving public safety. And if they were to say that that buffer zone was unconstitutional, in my mind, that's a statement about not just not caring about women and what women need, but what about the children who have to walk by and see the kinds of pictures of fetuses. There is actually a clinic in Brookline, which is very near a preschool. How are you as a parent going to shield your child from pictures like that? You can't if you're walking to school. There are lots of issues that have to do with exposure to ideas that are really hard for very young children to absorb. And 35 feet is not exactly stifling free speech. One of the objections you probably read about is that we have to yell. Well, we have to yell a lot in our lives. So I'm reminded, too, that back in 1994, in November, this was just 1 month before my late husband died of a sudden heart attack, a young student came into his office. He was a sociology professor at Brandeis, chair of the department. She was his student, and she ended up in his arms crying, sobbing, because her father, who was 3,000 miles away in Vancouver, had just been shot. In the leg. It was not life-threatening, but it was a very bad injury. And he had been providing care for 32 years. He was an OBGYN, and yes, he did abortions as well as caught babies. And this young woman was terrified because someone was trying to kill her father. Dr. Gary Ramalis, who is one of my heroes in this whole women's health field, 6 years later, he went right back to work. He was stabbed in the left flank. Fortunately, none of his organs were hit. Once again, put in the hospital. And years later, after he was still continuing to practice with a little bit more security around him, he gave a speech to a group of medical students called Why I Am an Abortion Doctor, which is available online. And I urge all of you to read it and share it with people who do not have an understanding of what it means to be a provider in this field. I mean, we think a lot about the rights of individuals to have these services, but we have to think about the men and women who are providing these services, often at great personal risk. And his story is an amazing one. In fact, that night I remember my husband came home and he was practically crying himself because he couldn't imagine how an undergraduate could absorb this and, be so far from her father, and that she had to even endure it was driving him crazy that day. So we do a lot of work around women's health, reproductive health and sexuality across the lifespan, and much of it is about midlife and older women's health. And I just want to give you one example of the kind of outreach we do. A couple. One is around the question of mammograms and mammographic screening. Is it something that every woman should do all the time, every year, every 3 years? What are the choices? What do the data show us? There's been a long-standing push to have all women see mammography as a kind of magic bullet, that it will somehow prevent one from dealing with cancer in the future. And fortunately, there have been some really good researchers who brought us back to the evidence. And one of them is Dr. Gilbert Welch, and I'm only going to just give you his name because it's unusual enough. He's based at Dartmouth Hitchcock, but he's written for the New York Times at least 3 or 4 times. Go read some of his pieces. He's written op-eds, and he's got one of the best ways of explaining to the public what we do and don't know about the efficacy of mammographic screening. And it's absolutely the right choice for some women. We're talking mainly about women now who don't have notable risk factors. And it absolutely is a rational choice not to do it for some women. And he does that rather articulately. It's one of those examples where the data might not suggest that there's one shoe fits everybody, the same size. The other issue that's been extremely controversial, and in the last edition of Our Bodies Ourselves, which is outside for you to look at, we have the most superb chapter on the perimenopause that has been written. And the reason it's so superb is we brought some 7 or 8 of the leading researchers and writers, people who worked on the Women's Health Initiative together, and we said, we want you all to sign off on this. And they argued for 3 months. But in the end, our editors got them all to sign off on it because we kept pointing to the evidence and they kept saying yes, and then, so we'd rephrase it so everybody could say okay. And it's, the jury is still out on some of the major questions around hormone therapy. But one thing that happened this last fall, I'm going to mention as an example of the kind of challenge we face, is that in a well-respected journal, the American Journal of Public Health, there was an article called The Mortality Toll of Estrogen Avoidance. And it made the sensationalist claim that more than 40,000 women have died unnecessarily because they avoided estrogen. Now, they used a very flawed mathematical model, and they did reference studies and data that had been collected during that Women's Health Initiative. It's more than 13 years of studying women, different kinds of studies. Some of them were randomized controlled trials, some of them were case studies. And this is something that was funded with taxpayer dollars, and it based at NIH, very important. And it was looking at breast cancer, heart disease, and osteoporosis, largely issues that concern midlife and older women. Well, there were critiques of this article in the American Journal of Public Health, and they're available on the internet. And Dr. Catherine DeAngelis, who was for many years the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, has been one of the most vociferous voices asking that when we have articles published about anything, that we make sure conflicts of interest are apparent. And this is one time where I think that the journal, APHA, did not do due diligence here. And there were people like Dr. DeAngelis who focused on the fact that the lead author for this article was in the employ of several pharmaceutical companies, some of whom were in the business of providing hormones. It's not always true, not always the case, that you will write a biased piece just because you've been paid by industry to do something. But very often it is the case, and we've got good studies that show this, that one way to try to avoid such bias creeping in, what we call a financial conflict of interest, is to choose who writes the piece very carefully, or make sure that the conflict of interest is divulged so the reader knows that. And Dr. DeAngelis has been very articulate about how we have to uncover misleading messages with evidence-based messages and keep our eyes on the prize, which is accurate information. We at Our Bodies Ourselves have been very careful to look at conflicts of interest, and it even affects where we'll accept money. We don't take any funding from the pharmaceutical industry. And we have a number of incredibly wonderful advisory board members, one of them who heads up OB/GYN at the University of Michigan Health System, Dr. Timothy R.B. Johnson, has been a terrific support for us. And he's in a medical school and in also functions at the School of Public Health, where they don't take pharmaceutical industry funding. Dr. Isaac Schiff, who heads up the Vincent services here at Mass General Hospital, has been a wonderful member of our advisory board. And he, for example, does not allow drug detail people to come in and do the educationals for their residents and for the medical students. They find people who are experts who are not in the employ of the pharmaceutical industry to cover these educational topics. And I might add that, you know, he's in a place that has the resources to pay such people to provide the educational services, and there are other schools that don't have those resources, so it's harder. And sometimes representatives of these companies actually are very smart and know a lot. Sometimes they're misleading. You don't always know what you're going to get. So we've been struggling with a whole range of issues like these, you know, whether it's getting good information about egg donation for a young woman on a college campus, whether it's about understanding the risks and benefits of a particular screening technique. Lots of women were wondering about the HPV vaccine. What does it do? What does it not do? And it's not at all a magic bullet that some people thought it would be, because the HPV vaccine doesn't deal with all types of the virus that lead to cervical cancer. So you still do the Pap test, you still do all the things you were going to do, because you do not know that you might not come in contact with one of those types of the HPV virus that can in fact lead to cervical cancer. So we've